Get started. I'm Jackie Bozzuto. I'm a partner here at Lowndes. I co-chair our hospitality and leisure division, and I've been practicing law in Central Florida for 32 years this week. Um, so Brendan and I are here today to talk to you about property taxes, commercial property taxes, some recent laws. But I want to introduce Brendan Lynch. He is one of my partners. He has been practicing law since 2005. He heads up our section that deals with property tax appeals and represents clients all throughout the state of Florida with regard to valuations, appeals, litigation at both the trial level and up through the appellate process. Not only does he practice law, he's very involved in the community and led the United Arts campaign this year to the best campaign they've ever had, even during the pandemic. So Brendan and I are just going to jump in and start talking about property taxes and what's going on in recent cases. Today, we're going to talk about valuations and the process, the appeals process, what you as a property owner or a tenant who's responsible for paying taxes needs to know. How does COVID-19 play into that, and how will it likely play into that? What I'm going to do is ask if you have questions. At the bottom of the screen, you will see a Q&A section. If you could post questions in there, then when we get to the end of the presentation, we will be happy to answer as many of those as we can. I anticipate that today our presentation will go about 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. My first question for Brendan is, can you give us an overview of the valuation process and the taxpayer appeal process and timing and how that works for everybody?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning for those of you that may be in a different time zone. It's great to be here with all of you. It's great to be here with Jackie, always, as she is one of my favorite partners that we work with here at Lowndes. A lot of you are familiar with the tax appeal process, but a brief primer is always useful here in Florida. We have two different avenues you can take when appealing your taxes, and the basics of it are: one, you can go through the Value Adjustment Board process, and that's a recommended administrative process that starts effectively this month. We're in August. So all of you that own property will get trim notices this month from whatever county or whatever counties you're in. And that mailing of that trim notice starts a 25-day window in which you can file a petition challenging your valuation for 2020. And again, these valuations that are published this month are based on a January 1st, 2020 valuation date. So that VAB process, as we call it, is an administrative process. You have a hearing in front of an individual that's called a special magistrate, who is an appraiser. And each side, the property appraiser and the property owner, present their sides of the argument at a scheduled appointment date, and that special magistrate will rule on the presentation, and within a 3, 4, 5 week period, will come out with a recommendation. That recommendation is ultimately 99% of the times ratified by the VAB, whether it's a reduction or a status quo of the original valuation. And then at that point, you have the opportunity to again appeal that valuation if it's a status quo decision, if you want to file a suit in circuit court, which is obviously a lot of what I do in my world. So those suits are generally filed in the spring and summer of the following year, which is when those deadlines hit. But we do have a two-tier process in which you can challenge your taxes. And as we'll talk about throughout the next 30, 40 minutes, we really want to give you some guidance as to what to expect this year as these trim notices come out, talk about next year even, and give a tip as to whether or not we think challenging this year is important as it relates to next year as well. And the teaser is, yes, we all need to be filing this year. So that's the process as we have it in Florida, different than in many other states, but it usually works down here through one of the two appeals processes.
So, for those of you in Orange County, there has been litigation this year. The Orange County tax appraiser used what is called the Rushmore Method evaluation for some years in connection with setting assessed values. Brennan, can you talk a little bit about what that is, where it came from, and why it's not a favorable method for taxpayers?
Yes. So not everyone on this webinar is a hotel owner, but all of you are property owners or represent property owners. One of the triggers for putting this webinar together originally was this really landmark decision that came down from the Fifth District Court of Appeal here in Central Florida earlier this summer, and that's, as you can see from the title, the Disney Yacht and Beach Club decision. So Disney has appealed all of its hotel valuations starting in 2015 in Orange County. The first one to go to trial was a single year evaluation, just 2015, for the Yacht and Beach Club, a large resort hotel here in Orlando, and went through to trial. Disney won at trial. It was appealed, and the determination from the DCA just came down, and quite frankly, was a mixed bag for both sides. Either side could claim victory, but I'll tell you, both sides lost something in that decision too. Two big issues came from that. One, as Jackie just referenced, is the appellate court said that the Rushmore method is an inappropriate valuation method for determining hotel valuations. And again, we'll tie this into other commercial types in a moment, but specifically for hotels, Stephen Rushmore is a longtime appraiser that for years has been pushing his Rushmore method, or now titled Rushmore Method evaluation, which says you can take out, briefly, it says you can take out management fees, you can take out flag fees from a hotel. And when you remove those fees and a couple other things, you can effectively take out any business value associated with the hotel. Now, the reality is in the 50s and 60s, that may have been a fine method where hotels were smaller operations and that flag fee to a Marriott or that management fee to Marriott was really all the business value there was. Nowadays, we have all sorts of other things that tie into a valuation of a hotel property. And Disney argued successfully at trial and ultimately successfully at appeal that the Rushmore method wasn't sufficient to remove all this intangible business value from its property valuation. In Florida, the valuation is supposed to just be land plus improvements. So just the land you're sitting on and the sticks and bricks. And the Disney argument, which again was successfully made, was that you are factoring in all these other business intangible values, which are not taxable under ad valorem taxation in Florida. So what this DCA decision has done is to say right now, the Rushmore method is inappropriate. And currently, the property appraiser in Orange County has appealed that very specific decision. Now, the Yacht and Beach Club decision dealt with a lot more, or had a couple other major issues in it, which I'll talk about in a moment. But that specific issue only is what's been appealed to both a full Fifth DCA en banc hearing, as well as ultimately they're going to appeal that to the Supreme Court because they believe the blanket determination that Rushmore method is never appropriate is overreaching on the part of the appellate court. So that is still outstanding as we're talking today.
And so, for those of the folks that are on the call or on the webinar um, that do have a possible Rushmore issue, what does that mean for them, and what should they be looking to do this year?
So that's the seminal question because we don't have a final outcome with rehearing requested and the appellate action still in play. The short answer is if you're a hotel owner, you should be if you're a hotel owner in Orange County, you should be appealing your 2020 valuation if you haven't already been appealing for the past 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because it is an outstanding question as to what should be done with that valuation process. The Orange County Property Appraiser, there's no way they could or will have changed their valuation method based on this decision, not just because they appealed it already, but because of the timing. Valuations in Florida are largely done between March and June. They're sent to Tallahassee for approval in July, and then those trim notices, which tell us what our valuations are, come out in August. So with a decision in June that came out from the Fifth DCA, there's no way for the Orange County Property Appraiser to have turned any changes in their valuation method around in that short a time frame. But if you have an open appeal for 2020 and on, there's the possibility that you could reap those benefits if, in fact, that valuation method is changed down the line. And again, that's an outstanding question. So appeal your 2020 valuation or continue to appeal if you've appealed previously. The other issue in this Yacht and Beach Club decision, which I want to make sure we bring up because it's going to tie into a lot of other folks on the call, is the court determined and the trial court determined, and then the fifth DCA agreed that they had an ancillary income method that was used to value hotels, but this could also tie into other properties. And the court and the appellate court said you can't just add on any revenue that comes into a hotel, and I'll say, or to other income producing properties, that's not related strictly to the realty. So in the Disney Yacht and Beach Club case, they would say you have this restaurant, and the restaurant brought in X number of $1 million a year. We're going to add that to your net operating income, as opposed to saying, which is what Disney argued, you should say, we would earn this much from renting out this restaurant. It's not the revenue that comes in from the restaurant, it's what we would earn from the space, from the real estate. And you should add that realty income, the rental income, onto the NOI. And that's what both the DCA and the trial court agreed should happen. So that ancillary income question is really a big deal. Rushmore is a big deal, Jackie, but the ancillary income is a huge deal. And because it's going to change not just how Orange County is going to value hotels, but how they may value other properties as well that have some sort of ancillary income that may not be tied to the real estate directly.
Okay. So, and they may do that, but unless you all appeal, they're not likely to do it on your taxes. So,
Sure. Yeah. And I think that's a great point, Jackie. You guys are going to hear this multiple times. And Rick Singh and his team in Orange County, or any other of the 66 other property appraisers around the state, don't love it when we say blanketly appeal this year. But the answer is, as we talk about COVID as well, and I'll say this multiple times more to all of you, appeal your taxes this year, appeal your valuation this year. You need to get your foot in the door. The folks in Orange County specifically, which is where we're located, so that's why we talk about it more. In Orange County, if you didn't challenge back in 2015 when valuations went up significantly, you lost that opportunity. And similarly for 2020, if you don't challenge at either the VAB stage or filing suit later in the year, one of those two windows, and there's a change in case law, there's a change in method, there's a change in legislation down the line, you'll lose that window to get a lower valuation and ultimately lower taxes.
so Brendan, talking about COVID-19, let's pivot that way a little bit and talk about why it's unlikely that COVID will have an impact on 2020 tax bills unless the legislature steps in and provides some relief, and what that might look like.
Yeah, I think, Jackie, this is the big question. So I love the law. Some of you may love the law on this webinar as well, but some of you may just not at all, not be interested in the details of a case like the Yacht and Beach Club. But what we all need to know is how COVID is going to impact our taxes for this year. And the short answer is, for 2020, all of us on this webinar are unlikely to see any reduction, any impact at all on our 2020 taxes based on the pandemic. And that's because of that valuation date, which is set in Florida as of January 1st of every given year. So in talking with a handful of property appraisers around the state and property appraiser representatives and counsel, they are all very aware, obviously, the pandemic. They're all very aware of impact on almost every type of business, and not just impact, but severe impact. Yet the not incorrect claim is that their hands are tied for 2020 because as of January 1st, there was no known impact. So for an income producing property, for January 1st, 2020, for a 2020 valuation, you look to the 2019 income stream, to the 2019 rent roll. And 2019 wasn't impacted yet by the pandemic. So despite the true effects of the closure of businesses and the lack of consumer spending in many retail spaces, those tax bills for 2020 are likely just to tick along as they would have if nothing had happened. It's going to be 2021 when we really see or are able to answer the question of what do property appraisers in the state of Florida and around the country do in relation to the pandemic. And I've put on this slide in one of those bullet points. My question to them is how low can they go? When you lose a third or half or more of your income stream for a year, or you have residents that can't pay, or residents that aren't required to pay because of, and you can't evict them. Uh, and what happens to that valuation? How low can you go for a particular year? And I'll add to that, Jackie, there's a the property appraisers are not in an envious position. I say how low can they go for 21, but the question will also be how does that impact future years? In Florida, we have a 10% non-homestead cap in place. And as many of you know, that means in a year-over-year scenario, uh, a market value of a property can only be increased by 10%. And so if you have a incredibly low 2021 valuation because of COVID, that means it can only increase 10% in 2022, which is going to be problematic, particularly if the world has, gotten back to some semblance of normalcy. There'll be a tax crunch as a result, and all these factors are going to come in play starting now through the next year.
So, Brendan, can you address a little bit sort of a reduction in assessment on a piece of property versus what other alternatives there might be for appraisers and what that would look like coming out of the legislature and where that will need to originate in order to give taxpayers some relief.
Yeah, Jackie. So when the impact was first being felt of the pandemic back in the spring, when businesses were starting to be closed by state mandate, or by county mandate, there was a brief respite given by the legislature and by the state government that allowed folks to pay their taxes a couple weeks later. So usually you have to pay by the end of March, and they gave a reprieve until April 15th or 16th. I forget what day it was this year, but a 2-week reprieve in order to pay folks taxes and not have any penalty or interest start being charged. In reality, that did nothing for anyone. Most folks, most businesses, if they can, they pay in November because they get a 4% discount on their taxes for payment in November, 3% in December, 2% in January, 1% in February. So most folks had already paid their 2019 taxes by the time that relief, I'll put in air quotes, came out. The only way there's going to be any relief for 2020 is going to be some similar action by the legislature. And this time, I don't mean a delay in or a 2-week reprieve in payment of taxes. The legislature would have to step in and say, similar to when a hurricane strikes or some other natural disaster, we are going to put a hold on your valuation for a year, or we are going to allow property appraisers to have a 20% reduction window for 2020 without taking the non-homestead cap into place for the following year. You can be creative with this and come up with some plan that would allow for relief this year for business owners, without impacting future years on a property appraiser or tax collection side. I'll say, however, there is no indication that the legislature is doing that yet. There were a couple of news reports a few weeks ago, Jackie, that talked about some property appraisers wanting to engage the legislature. So these are the duly elected independent property appraisers of each county. There was a handful of property appraisers that wanted to engage the legislature in trying to figure out how to provide some relief for property owners this year. And that means homeowners, commercial owners, every type of owner, as long as you own property in the state of Florida. And that just hasn't gained traction. There hasn't been an interest in the legislature in having any sort of special session. And without that, nothing will happen until the session is in play later this year through early of 21, which quite frankly is very late to have any relief announced for COVID.
Yeah. So, can you talk a little bit about the process for the trim notices coming out, what the deadlines are, what people sort of need to be looking at, um, and then we'll get back to that next slide on what we think the outcome is going to be, at least on local races. but
Sure.
what people's next steps are.
So most of you know this, it's only heightened this year. So your trim notice and the truth and millage notice, which shows your valuation, your proposed taxes for this year. And it's proposed taxes because millage rates aren't set by respective taxing authorities until October and November. So they have placeholders for millage rates based on last year, based on a small increase, and they give you sort of ideas of what your taxes could be this year. But the valuation is what's set. And that starts a very strict 25-day window to file those VAB, those Value Adjustment Board petitions. For the fourth time, fifth time, I'll say, file your petitions this year. It is a simple process. Most counties do it online. I'll say incredibly, not all counties do it online yet. And I have to be reminded of that each year when I get a call for a particular county late in the game, 24th day, 23rd day, and I call and say, "Are you guys doing it online yet this year?" I'm not going to name counties to this group, but there's a couple counties, and they'll say, "No, we're still not doing it online. You have to mail it off." So we're sending FedEx petitions to get there overnight. But most counties do it online. It's a $15 filing fee. You, I, you don't have to have an attorney do it. You don't have to have a tax consultant do it. There's recommendations to get experts like that involved at a later date. But to get the appeal filed, get that petition filed, you can do it online in about 15 or 20 minutes or less. So the recommendation this year is pay close attention, as you should always and every year, but pay close attention to when you get that trim notice this year. Make sure you have it. Make sure it's not being mailed to some property representative that may not be on this webinar, may not be as paying close attention. So make sure for every property you own, you're getting a trim notice, you're looking at the value. If you have no trouble with it, then don't file. But this year is such an unusual year that we think there's a strong argument to be made for challenging 2020 and then playing that into 2021 as needed when those COVID impacts are definitely playing out in the evaluation perspective.
Okay. So back to our prior slide. What are your thoughts on at least how this will play into the um, local election and maybe others around the state?
So I put this in here. I was about to say I'm not a political junkie. That's not true. I do follow politics nationwide, locally, statewide, but property appraisers races don't often get a lot of play in the press. There are a number of property appraisers, both incumbents that are being challenged, as well as there's some retirements occurring around the state. So there is an opportunity for new property appraisers to be elected this year. I'll say not selfishly because I'm in Orlando and in Orange County, but the big one around the state that folks are looking at if they're paying attention to this is Rick Singh, who is our current property appraiser, has a challenger this year, and Amy Mercado, who's a former state representative. And he's going for election for the third time. In 2012, he defeated Bill Donegan, who was the incumbent, and it was quite frankly a big surprise. In 2016, there was no real competitive race, and Rick Singh was reelected. This year is shaping up to be a competitive race. And it's important because valuation directives are top down. And Rick Singh, whatever you think of him, has changed the valuation process in Orange County, the tourism capital of the world. And that has impacted not just hotels and theme parks, but it's impacted anyone that has any relationship with hotels and theme parks. And not always for the worse. My implication here is not that he's just increased taxes across the board, but he has impacted folks across the board. So a change in leadership could result in a significant change in how valuation methods are done. And so we're going to find out in just 2 weeks, because August 18th is the primary date here. And this is Amy Mercado is also affiliated with the Democratic Party. So it's just Democratic registered folks that are going to be able to vote in this primary. There are actually 3 candidates, but these are the 2 main ones. And that winner is almost certainly going to be elected in the November election to be the property appraiser. And if it's not Singh, then we're going to, have another webinar sometime next year to say, what has Amy Mercado done in Orange County and how has that impacted things in the greater Central Florida area?
So, switching back to just logistics and what people should do, what happens if for some reason someone misses that 25-day VAB deadline to appeal? Can you let us know? Um, does that mean they can't file later on? What is the process if someone misses that deadline?
Yeah, great question. And this happens once or twice a year or more, but once or twice a year in my world. There's, as we talked about before, there's two tiers to filing an appeal in the state of Florida. You have a different window to file a circuit court suit. So the VAB process is really meant to be a process that's available to everyone. You don't have to have an attorney. You don't have to pay, $500 to file suit and then another 120 to serve those suits. So it's a less expensive, more available process for those to appeal, for those property owners to appeal their valuations for a given year. If you miss it, however, you can still file a suit within 60 days after the tax roll is certified within that particular county. Generally, tax rolls are certified in October, November, late October, early to mid November, which puts that 60-day window sometime in mid to late December to January. So if those of you on the webinar miss the window, don't get the trim notice for some reason, it sits on someone's desk, you just change your mind later. There's still that second window, but it requires filing suit. So obviously that becomes a bit more onerous and certainly a little bit more expensive right away. Suit's not a $15 filing fee, it's a $450 filing fee. So in addition to hiring a lawyer. So that process is more expensive, more serious, but it is still available and it is taken advantage of every year. There are some folks, Jackie, who don't believe in the VAB process. And I can't see faces and I'm not even looking at names of those in the webinar right now, but I know there are folks on this webinar right now that are shaking their head in affirmation of, I don't believe in the VAB process. Every county treats it differently. I'll say on the positive side, there are some counties, such as Miami-Dade, where the VAB process appears to be a pretty fair shake at things. 50-50, you win, lose. And that's kind of how it should be. There are some counties, such as Orange County, which boast of, and that's not a word I use lightly, but boast of a success rate at the VAB of 99+%. Now I'll say to you and everyone on the webinar, if you're winning 99% of the time or more, you can be really good and you're still not going to win 99% of the time. So the process has turned into one that there are many folks that skip it in Orange County now and file suit directly instead. So again, two-tier process. I still recommend filing the VAB petition in any county you're in because it just gives you a longer runway, gives you more time to talk to the property appraiser, gives you more time to get your own ducks in a row as far as looking at what your property value may be from an income analysis or looking at what it costs to build it or looking at different market comps. That VAB process gives you not only that longer runway, but effectively 2 bites at the apple in a lot of counties.
Okay. So, is there anything else that people should know regarding the process or this year?
Yeah. So I know I've said it a handful of times, and I realize that maybe there's a talking out of both sides of my mouth. I'm saying you're not likely to see 2020 reduction because of the way our system is set up in Florida, but I'm also saying appeal 2020. The real reason behind that is because particularly when suit is filed, I've not experienced in my 12, 13 years of doing this, a situation where there's been a suit filed challenging property taxes and just a single year is settled. It's always 2, 3, 4, 5 years. You're always incorporating more than 1 year. For example, 2019 suits around the state, the deadlines ran from, call it May through August. So there's still, Broward County's deadline still hasn't come upon us. But May through August is when suits were filed around the state challenging 2019 taxes after lack of success at a VAB hearing. By the time you file a suit in June, it's only 2 months later that the 2020 valuations are coming out. So you're automatically talking about 2 years. My position of encouraging folks, and I haven't encouraged folks to do this in a while, to file petition or a challenge this year is because if you end up filing suit, you're automatically going to be rolling 2021 into it, and 2021 is the real issue here. It's the year that nobody on this webinar knows what's going to happen with valuations. We know what could happen, but we don't know what the property appraisers around the state are going to be willing to do. So I'm already not looking forward to in an enthusiastic way, but I'm already preparing ahead to say, get your 2020 valuation challenge, roll the 21 challenge into it when the time comes next year. And then you're talking about 2 different years right at the outset, which I think has a lot of value when discussing settlement with property appraisers around the state.
Okay. Well, I think we are ready to open it up for questions. I don't see any in the question and answer box. If anybody has any, please feel free.
And I'll while we're waiting on that, Jackie, I'll riff for a second because I have a 3-year-old and 6-year-old at home, and this is like my adult conversation for the week. I have a lovely wife who's working downstairs as well, who also is a partner at Lowndes. But we are but we all miss adult conversation. But I will say that 2019 is gone. So I think that's always important to say, no matter what the Yacht and Beach Club decision or anything else, unless you have an active appeal in 2019 right now, or Broward's the only one I know that still has an open window for challenging your VAB results through suit. But 2019 is gone unless you have an active appeal. So oftentimes we'll get questions about what can I do about past years. And the only way to correct a past year absent having an open appeal is if there was some mathematical or some scrivener's error, I'll call it. And that's very limited and happens very rarely. It happens more often on the other side, quite frankly. You'll see a property appraiser make a correction years later where they will say, we missed this. And that is often a damaging blow to property owners that thought they had paid their taxes for that year and then all of a sudden discover a minor change. But it doesn't happen often in either situation. But understand for this group that 2019 is largely a done year unless you have an open appeal at this point.
Okay.
And I do see a question about more color around the Rushmore method of evaluation. And yes, so there over the last 15, 20 years, there's been 2 methods of valuation that have made the rounds around the country. One is the Rushmore method, and the other is the business enterprise approach. And its biggest proponent is a gentleman named David Lenhoff. Both these are East Coast guys, by the way, East Coast appraisers that have made their bones pushing their particular approaches to value, particularly in the hospitality industry and most specifically in hotels. They have some agreements with how they value things, but the biggest question is, how do you take out the business value of a hotel? Lenhoff's belief in the business enterprise approach is that you have to remove absolutely anything possible that ties into the running of the business. So, literally anything you do that's not just the land plus improvements, he wants taken out in some fashion. And he also has a big question for Lenhoff is, when folks invest in hotels, we should be removing what their expectations are, not only on a return of investment, but a return on your investment. And Rushmore only believes you should be removing something related to your return of your investment. So I could almost draw a chart with two different columns about what they believe. But Rushmore is largely just says, if you take out those management fees, take out those franchise fees, he ignores things like goodwill. He ignores things like client lists. Those don't place a value for him in that real estate valuation. And Lenhoff and ultimately this DCA said, no, you got to look at those things. You can't just say, what are you paying for a flag to your Sheraton or to your Four Seasons? You have to look more than that. And John, I can reach out to me. We can have a bigger conversation about Rushmore method and its appropriateness. It has been ruled appropriate in certain jurisdictions in the country, and now certain jurisdictions have said, no, we don't think that's right for an across-the-board valuation method.
We have a couple more questions that have come up.
Great. So, um, as a tenant, I'm reading the question now for you. As
Okay.
a tenant and phrasing the request to the landlord to file a protest to the tax valuation, should we reference the potential adjustments due to COVID-19 impact, or both, and that the Rushmore valuation challenge is out there if appropriate? The real question being, when you're requesting to a landlord, so, and this is either side, depending on who's responsible for the taxes, can you request your landlord or your tenant, should you refer to these reasons for filing a challenge? I say yes. I mean, hopefully in your landlord-tenant relationship, you have the ability to have a regular conversation and say, "Hey, we just listened to this guy who put on a suit. We haven't seen anyone wearing a suit for months, but it was great, and he said we should really be looking at 2020 um, in order to tie it in 2021." I think that gives the dichotomy, and that's what I'll be looking at when in what will likely be a large number of suits are filed again over the next year and 2 years. I think you want to be able to say, "Hey, we understand that January 1st there was not necessarily a known impact from pandemic, but the reality is starting in March through, pick your month, through August, through September, October, November, December, we were closed doors. We only had 20% of our capacity, whatever it is. And we recognize that under state law, maybe you don't feel you can do that, but we want to be able to tie that into the next year. So let's work together." Often my settlements with the property appraisers are based on those sorts of communications. We know you get it. We want to work with you, what you can do for us, and what information we can provide you to help you do that job. So I think I hope I answered that question. I think you can reference COVID and Rushmore with dealing with your landlord, but largely I think the message is there are multiple reasons to file a challenge this year. And I'll say blankly, unless of course you look at the valuation and say, "Wow, that's a deal." Don't rock a boat unless you need to rock a boat. But if you're at all questioning it, then challenge this year. I see a couple more, Jackie.
Yep.
So the next question that I see is hiring a consultant, whether on contingency or otherwise, to argue in Orange County advisable to get something on the record for a later suit. Great question. Thank you for asking that. The when you The VAB process is a wholly separate process from the circuit court process. So circuit court, if you have a unsuccessful VAB hearing in Orange County or any other county, and you file suit challenging that valuation, it's a de novo case. So the circuit court is hearing it new. They're not looking at the VAB result. The only reason the VAB result is important from that moment on is it determines who's the plaintiff and who's the defendant. So property appraisers also do sue property owners when they lose at the VAB. It doesn't happen as often. It doesn't happen that they lose as often, and it doesn't happen that they file suit as often, but it just changes the posture of the case. So the on the record is not as important. I will say there's some important to getting a dry run. The VAB can often be perceived as not only a trial run for how your argument sounds, but also a trial run for what the property appraiser is going to say. There is an evidence exchange in the VAB process, and that evidence exchange can be extremely valuable in determining after whether or not it's worthwhile filing suit. And while all information used by the PAs around the state is public record, or almost all of it, there's some confidentiality exceptions. It's more easily retrieved and received in the VAB process because there's a mandatory evidence exchange that occurs between the parties. So is it important to hire a consultant to argue? I would say consultants have a lot of data points that the average property owner don't have. They can look at how the market's doing. They can pull from CoStar. They can pull from other comps they know to determine what rental rates are, what sale prices have occurred. There's a lot of value to consultants, and when they're working on contingency basis, then it's not that it's no skin off your nose, but it's certainly no outlay at the outset. So there can be a lot of value there. And I see not a follow up to that question. And a follow up was whether it's worthwhile doing on your own. Every year, I talk to a few people and that are calling me to potentially hire me, and I work on I often work on an hourly rate. Sometimes I work on contingency. But is it worthwhile hiring someone on an hourly rate to do a VAB hearing? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but not for, you have to evaluate the potential, amount of reduction you can get in your taxes. If you're only talking about a $2,000-3,000 impact, which is real for everyone, but is it real enough to hire an attorney? Maybe not. Is it real enough to hire a consultant? Maybe, if they're willing to take it on contingency on with that sort of amount at stake. But as I was saying, 2 or 3 times a year, I say to that property owner, do it yourself. Call me afterwards and let me know if you have, or call me during if you have questions about how you're preparing things. I have these conversations every August, every September, every October. I enjoy them. I enjoy talking to say, yeah, let's walk you through it for 10 or 15 minutes and see what you think you can present and whether it's worthwhile, and then see how it goes. It's not like voting in that it's a civic duty, but it is a civic opportunity to see how this process works in Florida relative to your property taxes. It's fascinating. I mean, it's a little mini trial, mini hearing, but you're in a small conference room in some random office building, and you're on the other side of the folks that are determining your valuation. You have a chance to ask them questions. You have a chance to present your case. So taking it into your own hands is sometimes the right thing to do. And then if there's enough at stake and you don't get success, you can always file a suit later through an attorney.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. And even though we reserved an hour, we have no need to keep you all longer um, than the than we have questions. So I want to thank you all for coming and listening. Again, if you have questions or follow-up things, I know that Brendan would be more than happy to talk to people and see if there are ways to guide you in the right direction. Um, I
And,
think, do we have
and I'll
one
just say,
more?
Jack,
Yeah.
there was
Sure.
one more,
John
and,
Park. Yeah.
and I can reach out to John as well.
Mm.
I will say, to answer John and to give sort of a closing thought. Um, you know, appraisals aren't necessary at these stages to present your arguments. You can present things like your income data, your operating revenues, your rent rolls. If you have an income producing property, you can present your sale price if that is impactful towards valuation. Um, the the what the property appraiser is required to do, and I'll deal specifically with income producing properties now, is required to look at market data. They're not required to look at individual business data in evaluating a property. That's statutorily, they're supposed to look at market data and case law. The reality of it is we always present our individual data because if it shows that, hey, we're not doing as well as you think we are, you have us at this value, you have us at this rental rate, you have us, with this low expense ratio, and we are managing as well as we can, and we just can't do it at the level you say we can do it at. So we it's not cherry picking, it's providing data to the property appraiser that they can use to potentially provide a reduction on your property. That's my job. That's, as property owners, that's your opportunity. So I say, when these term notices come out, look at the value. And if there's data that you have in your records, again, rent rolls, income streams, sale prices, listings, offers, or you know what your neighbors are doing, you know what down the street is doing, your competitive set. That's the data we use to present to the property appraiser in a coherent format, to say, here's why we should be 10%, 5%, 25% less than you have us at. And that starts the conversation. But they're not mandated to look at individual income specifically from the property. They're supposed to look at the market, but they always do look at that data points too. So I think that answers part of John's question, but I wanted to talk big picture. When you do get those trim notices, take that time, that 3+ weeks, to look closely. And again, I think there's value in filing an appeal this year, but only but it's worthwhile to have that deeper dive, particularly this year as we prepare for next, when the COVID impact is really felt from a tax perspective.
Brendan, I want to say thank you, because I always learn something that I can share with my clients when we do something like this. With all of you, I know we are all struggling in this unknown time to figure out, how we survive and taking it a day at a time. With regard to Rushmore, when that decision comes out, we will report it on our website. For those of you who maybe have not gone to our website, there is a ton of free information and articles and writings on every aspect of how COVID-19 is affecting our clients, our businesses, our lives, from everything from employment matters and how to deal with safety issues to PPP loans and how to report. All that is free information. We update it every day with new articles. So please feel free to go there. And if you have questions about this area, we will report when a decision comes down on the Disney case, on that appeal. But there's also lots of other information. And if any of us here at the firm can help you in any way get through this, that's part of why we're here. So thank you all for coming, and I hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.